Good evening and welcome to this week's Resistance TV broadcast. Tonight we're discussing the threat to free speech in universities posed by the Education Secretary's threat to axe their funding unless they adopt the discredited working definition of anti-Semitism that's promoted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA. Kenneth Stern, who drafted the original text that's being used by the IHRA, says it's being subverted. And in December last year, Donald Trump signed an executive order based on the IHRA, which, according to Kenneth Stern, is designed to silence pro-Palestinian speech on college campuses. To discuss this issue tonight, my guests are Ilan Pappé, who's a renowned Israeli historian who's written extensively on the Palestinian struggle and is now based in Exeter, where he founded the European Centre for Palestinian Studies in 2009. My other guest is Jackie Walker, who's an anti-racism trainer and former vice chair of Momentum. And more recently, she's collaborated with Noam Chomsky on a volume of essays titled The Responsibility of Intellectuals. So let me start, if I can, with Ilan. And I just wonder, Ilan, is Gavin Williamson simply trying to imitate Donald Trump?
Well, probably the whole this set of tactics to stifle research, freedom of speech on the question of Palestine in British campuses is borrowed from the United States. The whole idea of the lobbies, whether it's the Christian Zionist lobby or AIPAC, is not to allow any serious criticism of Israel to be heard as part of an objective research. So I think, yes, I think in many ways the model is the United States, but I think it goes deeper than that. I think that although there were some achievements in the way anti-Semitism was weaponized in order to silence politicians like yourself and Jackie and others who were bravely supporting the Palestinian cause, it was all in the political realm, and you could somehow argue that the opinions are immoral, are anti-Semitic, and so on. This has worked for a while, but I don't think it achieved the kind of silence that Israel and its supporters wanted in the media about Palestine. They have a tougher role when it comes to the academia, because the allegation, or the definition, rather, of Israel as an apartheid state, of Zionism as settler colonialism, of the actions of Israel in 1948 as ethnic cleansing, of the occupation as a crime against humanity. All these are the results of research. They're not just political opinions. And, just accusing these kinds of conclusions as anti-Semitic is definitely not going to work. So they're trying something more focused to claim that these kinds of articles, lectures, modules, curriculum are actually similar to the denial of the Nakba, denial of the Holocaust, as a Holocaust denial. Equating actually proper academic research, proper work of committed academics, but nonetheless professional and ethical academics, with the denial of the Holocaust, is of course an abuse of the Holocaust memory. And I say this as someone of many members of whose family were killed by the Nazis in the Second World War. It abuses the Holocaust memory, but more important than anything else, it seems, at least as an initial stage, to work, as quite a few universities have already signed into it. And it's very worrying whether, with this kind of campaign of intimidation would lead to similar outcomes as it did in the political scene.
Where do you think, if the Secretary of State gets his way, it will leave academics like yourself and the European Centre for Palestinian Studies? Is that a worry that it will stifle your ability to practice as an academic?
It's a genuine worry, indeed. I think what is really worrying is not so much the definition of the IHRA. What is worrying is that the government is also adopting the examples given with the
Yeah,
definition. The definition is quite vague, to be
yeah,
honest, and could not easily be implemented. But it is the list of examples that turn much of what our PhD students are doing, our master students are doing, the modules that we are teaching, the fantastic works that we have published and we're going to publish, all of it, at least allegedly, can fall under one of these examples as a denial of the Holocaust. This is worse than McCarthyism in America in the 1950s. This is something, for example, apartheid South Africa has never dared to ask universities in the UK to stop research on apartheid in South Africa. It's really, it is worrying because the universities immediately adopted it without really thinking about the ramifications. I'm very happy to see, I don't know if you know about it, but there's a petition that is growing by the day of most of the scholars who work on the Middle East in general, and most of the students who study not only on Palestine, but study Middle Eastern studies. This petition is growing by the day, asking their universities not to adopt either the definition or its examples. I'm worried on the one hand, but I'm sure that my colleagues and my students, and I trust my management in university, at least in my university case, that we will continue to produce the excellent work that we have been doing on Palestine, which will help to bring justice and freedom to the country of Palestine and the people of Palestine who deserve it.
Isn't Gavin Williamson, do you think, Ilan, creating something of a catch-22 situation, though? I mean, I saw a few weeks ago, anyway, where I think it was a majority of universities at that point in time hadn't signed up to it. And I think this was what led to him issuing the threat to axe funding if they didn't sign up by the end of this year. But it worries me that universities, intellectuals, people like yourself could be faced with, as I say, a catch-22 situation where if the university doesn't sign up, funding will be cut. And if they do sign up, it's going to fetter your ability to practice as an academic, particularly in the field that you are focused in. Is that a real fear, or am I sort of getting it wrong, do you think?
No, you're not exaggerating. I think you're right. Either way, it's we are faced with a terrible dilemma here as university management and as faculty members who work on Palestine. I think we also have to see it in a wider context. And if I may, just one sentence about the wider context. I think it's very important to understand where it comes from, because it will help to combat it, to confront it more effectively. This is part of the whole Trump deal of the century. It doesn't look like it, but it's an integral part of it. The basic idea of the Trump deal of the century, of course, supported by the Netanyahu government, was to depoliticize the Palestine issue. To say, actually, there's only some economic and humanitarian issues, but the political issue has been resolved. Now, it doesn't look like it if you look at what academics are doing, what activists are doing, what many sections of the civil society are doing around the world and on Palestine. And I think that this is part of this assault on the moral struggle of the Palestinians to still be heard as an unresolved moral and political issue, because the governments that be and the political elite are willing to go along with the Trump administration and Israel and to really disregard the Palestinian rights and their aspirations. So I think this is part of a struggle between a very committed civil society in Britain and around the world and political elites who, either because they are intimidated or they're timid or they have, more cynical consideration, are willing to go along and perpetuate one of the most unjust situation on the ground that has been going on for more than a century.
Yeah. Let me bring Jackie in then, because as I say, Jackie collaborated with Noam Chomsky in those collection of essays on the responsibility of intellectuals. I just wonder, Jackie, what do you think should be the response of intellectuals, academics, in seats of learning in universities up and down the country? Because some universities have signed up. I mean, some have bravely said, no, we're not prepared to do that. But some have. I mean, what do you think the academics in those institutions should do in the face of their management actually signing up to this discredited IHRA working definition?
Can I just say that one of the things that was in my paper, which then became a chapter in the book with Chomsky, was the need for us to rethink what we understand, not just the function of the intellectual is, but who the intellectual is. Because of the structural racism in our society, many people, including women, but certainly a number of oppressed minorities, are excluded from the professional classification of being an academic or an intellectual. So one of the things I did was reinterpret that and actually say, you know, you can be an intellectual by the way you analyze what's happening on your shop floor, what's happening in your workplace, what's happening in your home. But even that taken into account, what we've got to understand is what the actual function of an intellectual is, which is fundamentally to analyze what they see around them in society and to gather evidence and do research and to interpret their world in as accurate and truthful a way as they can. And that analysis, the rigor behind the analysis, is actually backed up by what is called peer review. Now, what peer review means, for those of you who don't know it, is that a body of other academics who are themselves qualified to look at your research will examine your research, the questions you have asked, the methods you've got, and make some kind of judgment about it. And that, if you like, in modern day universities is the backbone of how it works. So it is absolutely essential for intellectuals to do their work, for them to have freedom of thought and the ability to look at evidence and interpret it. Now, I just want to say one more thing about this. And for this, I'm going to bring in a bit the IHRA and the laughable response that there's been about it.
That's the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, for those who are just wondering what the IHRA is.
Yes, because there you have this extraordinary situation, especially for an intellectual, where we're being told that evidence of anti-Semitism doesn't matter, and the number of incidents doesn't matter. In fact, we were told that to do so by the Labour Party would be an expulsion offence. So you're going directly against the very logic by which intellectual thought is made. Now, what I want to say to people on this is, if you think that this is a nice little confined issue, you know, and people have said to me, look, why aren't you talking about the poor or the NHS or whatever? Why are you talking about this particular issue? Why this issue is important is anybody who actually believes that if they get away with censoring speech and censoring research on this topic, that they won't do this again and again is I'm sorry, you just don't know what the history of thought and politics is. So this is absolutely critical, not just to the struggle of the Palestinians, but for the struggle to maintain intellectual freedom. And that is why so many academics have set their face against it.
I mean, do you think then that is something of a Trojan horse? I mean, is that the motivation why the government are so exercised by this, do you think, Jackie? I mean, it's curious that they are staking so much on forcing universities to adopt the working definition in its entirety. I mean, it seems an extraordinary step to take. I mean, is your assessment that it's the thin end of the wedge? It's a Trojan horse, that they do this and then it will enable them to go further in other areas? Or what do you think the motivation is?
I don't think that's how these things work. I suspect somebody like Gavin Williamson, who isn't the sharpest tool in the box, is not thinking in that way. He is part of a general witch hunt that's going on, and he gets lots of brownie points for saying this kind of thing. I think other people are thinking this, and I think there is also the law of unforeseen consequences, which we can see. And there is absolutely no doubt in my mind. I mean, the extraordinary thing, I have, my son lives in China, and there was news today of what was happening in China to their dissidents. And there was a commentary on the BBC about how terrible this was, that you couldn't have freedom of speech in China, for people to speak out. And I thought, you have to be absolutely joking. And that's what I mean by this is the thin edge of this wedge. Because as soon as we enter this level of doublespeak, then doublespeak can be used in all sorts of ways. So I have no idea if Gavin Williamson is thinking in this way, but I'm sure there are people who are thinking like this.
No, indeed. But Jackie, even before any university embraces the IHRA working definition, we know, I mean, and you've been a victim of this, I've been a victim of it as well. It's almost impossible now, if not impossible, actually, for me to speak at any university around the country. I've been invited on a number of occasions to speak on a range of different topics, not on this issue, actually, not on the issue of the Israel-Palestine conflict or anything like that. And, I've been prevented from doing so. I've not been allowed to speak. I've been sort of cancelled, as it were. And I know you've been a victim of that as well. And that's, I think that's a very kind of sad state of affairs, isn't it? That, students are not being allowed to hear different viewpoints, and people are being demonized based on a myth. I mean, you're an anti-racism trainer, and, I've been an anti-racist activist all my life, and yet we are somehow being demonized as some form of kind of terrible bigots who are anti-Semites. And, people, I mean, this point you made about brownie points, it seems that, so some of the people in the student movement and further afield, almost as if a kind of a knee-jerk response, say, well, we can't have Jackie Walker, we can't have Chris Williamson. We just don't like their persona. We don't like, what they represent. I mean, this is.
Well, I think actually, I think what we have is a growing culture of offence. If certain people say they're offended, then suddenly it sets up signals. But the interesting thing about this culture of offence is it's only about certain people. So notice, for example, that when Muslims have told the Labour Party their sense of offence about who's funding Starmer's new Labour Party, somehow their offence is actually not measured in a quite equal manner. But this thing about cancel culture, I think, is also more complex, because in fact, there's also a move by the right to fight against cancel culture. Now, one of the things that I said actually in that chapter I wrote is that one of the things that the right have very cleverly done is taken, if you like, our ideas, our vocabulary, our concepts, and inverted them to use for themselves. And so we have, the terms of anti-racism are being used against anti-racists. So we have newspapers and other people who we know say anti-black, anti-Muslim thing, suddenly jumping on this wagon of pointing the finger and calling people like Jeremy Corbyn, like yourselves and like myself, who have campaigned all their lives as anti-racist, racist. But what we're now seeing is the Zionists and the establishment now saying we've got to stop cancel culture. But of course, what they mean by cancel culture, is that they want to stop people protesting against the Israeli ambassador coming in to speak without a mixed audience. They want to stop those kind of protests. So I think we have to think about what we mean by freedom of speech. And one thing I was very keen to do, I remember Wes Streeting tweeting out at me, I think it was a year or so ago.
MP for Ilford, isn't he? One of the Ilford constituencies.
Yes. And well, his views are quite well known in terms of Israel and Palestine. And he tweeted out to me and he said something like, I'd like to invite Jackie Walker to come and speak at one of my local synagogues and just see what would happen to her. So I tweeted back to him and I said, great, set it up, do it. And he went totally silent. And I kept repeating and I kept repeating. And I think in the end, he actually blocked me. Because, of course, what these people don't want, the last thing that they want is freedom of speech. Because if they meet people like Ilan or myself or many others than me who are much more eloquent than me, they know that they will be defeated by the logic and the evidence and the history of our argument.
Yeah. No, I mean, I take your point as well about the kind of the right turning our vocabulary, as it were, against us. And I'm reminded when you said that of the demonstration organised by essentially a pro-Zionist board of deputies and the so-called Jewish Leadership Council in Parliament Square a couple of years ago. And some of the people who joined that demonstration against the Labour Party included Norman Tebbit. Phenomenon, you know, when he was saying, you know, South Asia, you know, we have to, which side are they supporting in the test match, you know? And this guy's there, you know, allegedly calling out anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, bigotry in the Labour Party. I mean, a ridiculous state of affairs. But Ilan, I mean, just in terms of that point about students, you know, student bodies, you know, moving against, I mean, this is before the adoption of the IHRA, but moving against invited guests like myself and Jackie, and I'm, you know, I'm sure there'll be plenty of others as well. What should people like yourself, you know, academics in these institutions be doing in the face of that? And indeed, what are they doing in the face of that? And are they, you know, engaging in discussions with the student bodies as to what they're doing? I mean, it seems absolutely, well, it's very hurtful to stop. It's absurd stopping somebody like Jackie Walker, and dare I say myself, you know, from coming and speaking, as I say, on topics completely unrelated to this issue. Not that we should be prevented from speaking on this issue. When I say this issue, I'm talking about the Israel-Palestine issue. We shouldn't be prevented from speaking on that issue either. But just the very fact of the name Chris Williamson, the name Jackie Walker, seems to strike, you know, sort of fear or horror into the hearts of these some of these student bodies, and you know, we are accountable, or they come under pressure and they crumble under the pressure. I mean, what do academics do in the face of that?
Well, unfortunately, academic courage can be an oxymoron, you know. And it's difficult. It's not a community. I'm talking about the faculty, mate. It's not a community of activism. It's people who are concerned about their jobs, their careers. They're very vulnerable in that respect, and they will ask themselves whether it's you know, cost benefit for them to endanger their career and so on. And if the government, if it seems that the government supports this culture of silencing and intimidation, they would even be more reluctant to do it. This is why I founded many years ago with Rada Karmi the first ever Center for Palestine Studies, because we understood that individuals cannot do it. What we need is a safe space, academic safe space, where we can invite whoever we want on Palestine, where we can study whatever we deem is important to study, and where we keep both the professionalism on the one hand and the moral commitment on the other. Luckily, another center was soon after established in SOAS. I hope that another one is going to be established in Cambridge. I think the more spaces like this you will have, the more ability you'll have in kind of countering that kind of silencing that you are talking about. I think the student bodies are, especially the Palestine societies around British campuses, are very brave young people.
Yeah.
Really should be commended. They do once a year an Israel Apartheid Week. I'm sure they can invite you and Jackie. And I think they are continuing on a daily basis to make sure that their voice is being heard. They are also very well connected with each other in different universities. So I expect a bit more from the student community than the academic community. But I should say this, we have a very prestigious society in Britain, BRISMES, the British Society of Middle Eastern Studies, really one of the oldest in the world, one of the best. And this community of scholars around the UK who work professionally on the Middle East, not just on Palestine, and on other oppressed groups around the globe, are being heard and are protesting and are doing all they can to counter this assault on academic freedom and freedom of speech. I think we're in the midst of this battle.
Yeah.
It's too early to conclude, and there are setbacks. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
I do expect, and this is where my optimism comes from, I hope I'm not wrong, it's much more difficult to do exactly what Jackie was saying about the political side of things. Namely, you yourself, Chris, and Jackie, you could be accused of anti-Semitism and nobody needs to bring any evidence, really.
No.
But the allegation itself is enough to throw you out of the Labour Party.
Absolutely.
An allegation itself is not enough to close an academic center. It won't work that easy, I hope. And an allegation should not be enough to end someone's academic career. I've seen it happen. It happened to me in my own university in Israel. I was kicked out. So I don't want to be naive on this. I've seen how even academics with tenure, I was an academic with tenure, can be thrown out if what they say is against what the governments want to hear. But I hope that I'm right, that this might have been a step too far. I hope so. I can only hope that it's one step too far in the weaponization of anti-Semitism, now Holocaust denial, in order, and let's remember what's the main motivation here. The main motivation here is to justify the unjustifiable.
Of course.
Zionism, I can understand lobbying for Zionism in the late 19th century. I can understand lobbying for Zionism in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, although I think very conscientious people understood that on the one hand, it offers a solution for anti-Semitism in Europe. On the other hand, it becomes a settler colonial project on the ground in Palestine. But this is a conundrum. Why in 2021, a state which is a high-tech nation, which has the strongest army in the region, needs to be lobbied? Even apartheid South Africa didn't lobby for South Africa. They wanted immunity against sanctions. Iran wants the sanctions to be lifted. There's not one state in the world that lobbies for itself. The reason is there is a moral issue here. There's a problem. with the very idea of an ethnic racist state that the West considers to be part of the civilized nations. That's the problem. Politically, militarily, strategically, Israel is a viable state. There's so much cynicism from Beijing to Washington, and from Washington to Moscow and back, that they have nothing to worry from governments. I mean, governments of the world, the neoliberal system, the multinational corporation, they don't see Israel as a problem. They don't see anything as a moral issue anyway. They don't have morality among their consideration. But it seems that the public does. The public, the civil society, not only in Britain, in many parts of the world, sees the double talk about Israel, the hypocrisy, knows so much of what goes on the ground, and feels that this immorality should not continue. Now, you cannot fight this kind of struggle for justice with F-16s, with tanks, with nuclear weapons, with all the might that the government might have. So they're trying to reach to the governments of the day and ask them to intimidate academics, journalists, politicians. They don't want them to be heard, as if silencing us would lift away the immorality of what they are doing. It won't help them. The immorality stays even if Jackie is not allowed to speak in SOAS. Israel is still an immoral pariah state, even if the three of us, disappear tomorrow. The injustice is not going to disappear. And that's why I'm very optimistic about it. As an historian, I don't think unjust regimes in unjust situations stay forever. And I think we have now a new networking that began with Black Lives Matters in America, with the Zapatistas in Mexico. There's a new networking of solidarity and identification. It's not just about Palestine. It's about people who were neglected, who were oppressed, and their oppression was denied. The Holocaust is not denied. Almost everyone who matters, everything that matters, acknowledges, and rightly so, the Holocaust. The whole German nation and state acknowledges its crime and is doing the right things to rectify it. What is not acknowledged is the Holocaust of the African Americans. What is not acknowledged is the genocide of the Native Americans. What is not acknowledged is what Britain did to the people of Ghana and Kenya. What is not acknowledged is what has been done to the Palestinians and other indigenous people who were genocide or ethnically cleansed by settler colonial projects. This is the big denial. This is where you would have loved to see the civilized world have a new covenant that says, we are going to fight. And let me just say one sentence, and with this I will end. In the 1960s, finally, international legal tribunals were willing to include colonialism as a violation of international law. Because up to then, the colonized world did not allow us to include colonialism as a violation of international law. But when someone suggested of including victims of settler colonialism, namely the Native Americans, the Palestinians, the Africans in South Africa, all these settler colonial states, including Israel, insisted that this would not be included as a violation of international law. This is the fight we need to fight, that these kinds of unjust violations of basic rights, which in many cases continue until today, should be a part of our struggle for a better and just world.
So Jackie, how and why then do you think the Zionist lobby has been so successful? Because clearly they have an influence, it seems, on government and the pressures, as I say, that they're putting on universities now. They've had an influence in terms of the way the Labour Party has interpreted anti-Semitism and adopting the IHRA, and the list goes on. How and why do you think, and I'll come to Ilan as well and get his thoughts on this, how and why do you think the Zionist lobby has achieved so much in the UK? Indeed, not just in Britain, but around the world.
Well, I think they have achieved a lot, and yet I think their response in terms of their savagery around trying to shut off free speech shows you how deeply terrorized they are. And they're terrorized by exactly what Ilan Pape has just said, because they know that while they are, again, I'm going to slightly change what you said. I mean, the way you've proposed it, it's as if the interests of Israel and the ruling class or the establishment, whatever you want to call them, are different. They're not. These are the same people. These are the same interests. So of course they back Israel. Of course they do. You know, I mean, they recognize each other as being the same, who have the same interests at heart. But what they also know, and this is what disturbed them so much around Jeremy Corbyn, is that they're losing the argument in civil society. We see this happening in America, in particular with Jews in America, where younger people are losing their support, not anymore giving such unqualified support for Israel. But we know that it's here and it's amongst us, and it's so passionately felt. You know, sometimes you have to measure something by how vociferously the enemy tries to shut you up. And I have to
whenever it was thus, Jackie, do you think it was, is this, because it seems to have come into sharper focus now, and I think around Jeremy Corbyn, but I mean, are you suggesting then that, you know, the kind of Zionist lobby's always had a very significant influence then and been very close with, you know, government and senior figures?
You know, my problem with the Zionist lobby or the Israel lobby is not because I don't think there's a lobby, it's because I think it too much makes a dividing line.
Right.
These are the same interests. I think it was very interesting today when I read something which was basically saying, and I don't know if this is true, by the way, that the German government have now decided that that they're going to view Israel as in fact part of Europe, and therefore be giving over the immunization for COVID to Israel, but not for Palestinians. Now, the point is not whether that is actually true or not. It's a bit like the Eurovision Song Contest or many other organizations. They see Israel as part of Europe. That is not a coincidence. It's because that's what it is. It's a piece of Europe implanted in the Middle East to do a very particular political job, and that is what it does. That's
what is that political job then, Jackie, in your opinion?
It's to be a bulwark in the Middle East, and it's to protect the interests of the West in the Middle East. And it's to make sure, I mean, for example, you know, this recent murder, I don't call it an assassination, actually. What happened was somebody was murdered.
The Iranian scientist.
The nuclear scientist. He wasn't assassinated. He was actually murdered. Now, whether you think it was good to murder him or not is another thing. And this issue about, you know, everything points towards Israel. This is the kind of thing Israel does all the time. Now, just think of, you know, had that been China doing that, or when Russia was pointed to for having got involved with the Salisbury poisoning, just think what happened. The reason it doesn't happen to Israel is because they're seen as us. They are us. The establishment see them as absolutely one and the same. But again, thinking about what's happened recently, and I've been in this game a long time, and certainly as a Black person, I understand that struggle doesn't just last 5 years or 20 years. It can last hundreds. It can absolutely last hundreds of years. And what I know as a fact, because I was going around the country talking to people about this, is that the level of awareness now on the issues around Palestine and the issues around Zionism and how the Israelis work and how power works with that is now so much more sophisticated and so much higher. because of what they have done with the witch hunt. I could not have raised that awareness with tens of thousands of activists. Tens of thousands of activists now understand what's going on. Now that is what you call one of those kind of unforeseen consequences thing, for people who are trying to protect Israeli interests. It's one of those and that will have consequences that nobody can yet know.
What do you think to that, Ilan? Do you agree with that? Has the kind of the Israel lobby overstretched itself then in that sense, do you think? And it actually counterproductive?
Yes, I agree with Jackie. I also said it myself. I think that with the adopting the IHRA kind of definition as a new policy to stifle academic debate was overstepping that. And I agree. I think that by declaring the struggle for moral justification for the immoral policies as a strategic objective of the State of Israel, they have a special ministry for strategic affairs that deals all the day with anti-BDS legislation, with
boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Yeah.
Sorry?
I'm just saying, just explaining what BDS is, if you just want to kind of
the boycott, divestment, and sanction campaign, and doing similar jobs in America. I think that just highlights the issue that if you need power to convince people of your moral standing, you're in trouble. You're definitely in trouble. They don't know how to deal with it. Like political elites don't know how to deal with the COVID-19. I mean, they know how to deal in military or what they would call security situations. They can assassinate, and I agree with Jackie, they can assassinate a chief scientist in Iran, but what do they do with a professor that tells the truth about what they're doing on the ground? Will they use the same means, same methods? So they're trying to use other means and so on. So I definitely think that in the end, this would fire back. I agree. But I just want to warn all of us, it will take some time. It will take some time. There will be setbacks. It is an assault. It is a serious assault. It can touch the well-being of people, their jobs, their careers. It's an ugly affair. It's an ugly warfare. It's really a warfare in many ways, fought in other means. And I think we should be ready for this. And we should struggle against it. It's a formidable foe, if you want, in many, many ways. But I really think that somehow all this might doesn't work, because at the end, as Jackie said, I mean, it's about facts, it's about morality, it's about justice, and they have a very weak case. I can end this, but I think I mentioned it in my book, The Idea of Israel, that Netanyahu in 2010, when he launched a campaign called BIG, Brand Israel Group, he called it. He hired the best PR agencies, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom, to try and commodify Israel in a more positive way. And in his kind of inner discussion, as I mentioned in the book, with the people who were supposed to launch this big operation on both sides of the Atlantic, he said, you just have to make sure that they don't ask you about the occupation. Tell them that Israel invited the chewing gum, which is, by the way, I'm not sure, maybe it's true, I don't know if Israel invented the chewing gum or not. But this was the whole idea. The whole idea was, I think, if I remember correctly from my book, he even said, you can't win the argument about the occupation, so make sure the conversation is not about it. Yeah. But that tactic is not working when the occupation continues. It doesn't work when the colonization continues. It doesn't work in the 21st century where people know what's going on. Maybe, 100 years ago, you could hide actions like this. But every house that is demolished, every Palestinian children that is being taken to jail, every Palestinian who is imprisoned for longer time without any trial or being expelled, every Palestinian who loses his house or his business or his land or her land because of Israeli action, each such act is being recorded, is being reported, is being digested. If Israel wants to stop what it calls the campaign of delegitimization, it should look at itself and ask why there is this campaign. It's very easy for them to say, oh, it's anti-Semitism, that's why they do it. But I think even they themselves know, they really know that this is not about anti-Semitism.
I mean, the behavior.
They feel that in order to fulfill this project of having as much of Palestine as possible and as few Palestinians as possible, the only way of doing it is through criminal policies that, to their great delight, governments around the West are supporting or are silent about, but they don't know what to do with the civil society that knows too much and does not follow the government's lead on this, thank God.
Well, I guess if we've got the means to communicate as we do now through the sort of social media, the opportunity to share these images, these abuses. I mean, it seems to me they're behaving like colonial powers have done down through the ages. You kind of touched on this, I think, in your opening remarks, Ilan. But this isn't a phenomenon in terms of the the impact on free speech in this country and in universities in particular, which is the theme of the initial discussion this evening. But obviously, we've mentioned in the United States where there's an issue. But I wonder, just before I bring in Sean to get viewers' observations, Ilan, if you could maybe just give us your thoughts on the situation elsewhere in Europe and in other parts of the world in terms of the way in which the kind of Israeli kind of lobby is it as influential in other nations and continents around the world as they are here, and is it similar tactics? Perhaps you can just give us a quick summary of the situation elsewhere.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, I think Britain is not exceptional here. In fact, in the United States, unfortunately, in the last year, or the last 2 years, 2 or 3 of my colleagues were sacked from universities because of their pro-Palestinian position. There's great pressure on other colleagues of mine who work in American universities. There is a kind of concentrated assault also in Canada. There is an attempt to legislate in a way that would stifle the freedom of speech on Palestine. This is about the United States and Canada. Germany, we already touched a little bit upon it. Of course, there is the famous legislation in the Bundestag about BDS being an anti-Semitic move, and German universities stopped inviting Palestinian speakers. They just stopped inviting them because they're afraid that someone will check that this particular Palestinian person supported once or still supports BDS, and then government funding would be withheld from that university. So the tactics are the same also in France, also in Italy, and other countries. And I think what is needed is really a global counter campaign, not just in Britain. And some of us are working on it. I mean, we definitely, but I think that we have now very strong allies who know that their own history has been silenced and might be still silenced, whether these are African Americans, Native Americans, women, workers. I mean, there's so many groups whose history is unpleasant to the eyes of those in power. And one way of showing it is by throwing, of course, into the river statues of a slave trader. Another one is by changing the curriculum in British schools, which hasn't been done yet. By changing the curriculum in British universities, which hasn't been done yet. And really I don't know if you ever saw the textbooks in British schools about the history of the empire. But this is really incredible. When people told me about it, I didn't believe them. I said to them, come on, this is Britain, 21st century. And then I started looking at the textbook.
Yes, exactly.
None of the evil and really criminal policies during the time of the empire are even mentioned. It's incredible.
You know, the point I was making, Ilan, when you was referring to some of the horrors that are inflicted on the Palestinian people by the settler colonial Israeli authorities, you know, exactly the same tactics used by this country, by Britain, by all colonials down through the ages. And I guess your message from what you're saying in conclusion, if I can summarize it, is it's about, in terms of how we respond to that, it's that old-fashioned word that I keep going on about, solidarity. And we need international solidarity and international campaign, it seems. We're running out of time, and I want to give an opportunity to Sean to let us know what our viewers have been saying about the conversation and put any questions you might have or observations to you and get your thoughts on them in the last 10 minutes. Sean.
Good evening, everyone. What an interesting discussion again this week. Lots of people on the line. We've got over 100 people watching live this evening. Lots of comments coming in. Mike Barson says, one hopes that, like the end of McCarthyism, at a certain point their position will become so far from reality that it will become untenable and will collapse. He goes on to say a lot of people are just not that interested and so don't appreciate the depth or abuse and hypocrisy at play here. Faraz Khan says written records are being destroyed to warp history. That's why we must record all the evidence online or on hard drives. And Stuart Wheeler says there was a pressure against Labour under Ed Miliband because he committed the party to recognise the state of Palestine, but nowhere near as effective as that against Corbyn. Would the witch hunt have been possible without the willing cooperation of the Labour Party bureaucracy? I have a few more questions, but if you'd like to answer that one first, I think that's a good question.
Jackie or Ilan, who wants to go on that one?
About the Labour Party. Where shall I start? Well,
would the witch hunt have been possible without the willing cooperation of the Labour Party?
And look, let's be frank here. It's not just the cooperation of the Labour Party, by which I'm sure you mean structures of the Labour Party. It's what I now call the PLP elite, because the PLP elite do not see themselves as in any way in relationship to the membership. They are a self-perpetuating elite. But actually, we've also got to understand that some of the responsibility for what happened, it was not just with the right and not just with the bureaucracy and not just with the PLP elite. It was also with some on the left who are still now apologizing and still now saying, let's just do this, we can draw a line and it will all be all right. And actually what we need to do is to move into solidarity with Starmer. I mean, what?
Yeah.
You know, that's like asking the Palestinians to move into solidarity with Netanyahu. You do not move into solidarity with your enemy. You fight them, you defeat them, and you defeat them by understanding what's going on. So one of the lessons that we have to learn as a left is to actually read some history, understand what's going on, and understand where the power is.
Yeah. By the way, the PLP elite, in case somebody's wondering what that is, that's the Parliamentary Labour Party, the so-called Labour MPs. But anyway, let's have the next one. Then we'll bring Ilan in on the next one. What was the other question? You said there's some other questions, Sean. There's some people who've got.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go to Becky M&M. She says, in the Al Jazeera documentary, The Lobby, there was discussion of funding going to Zionist student groups. Is the activity of funded Zionist students on campus evident in this country?
Ilan?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. In fact, Israel is quite proud in the way it recruits students in British campuses to work for the lobbying for Israel. And by lobbying for Israel, it means silencing the discussion on Palestine This could be by monitoring suspicious lectures, or by interrupting events and so on. So yes, this is it's not even a hidden structure. This is the main, I think, issue for Jewish communities around the world, that Israel expects not just its own students who study abroad to be working in this lobby campaign, but also Anglo-Jewish students to work on it. Now, I don't know how many of them respond and how many of them don't, but I think the very pressure should have been rejected by the Anglo-Jewish community. I'm afraid the official bodies of Anglo-Judaism, of the Anglo-Jewish community, are not going to criticize this kind of recruitment or this kind of an attempt to create a structure for lobby from within. Of course, in the United States, this is far more institutionalized, because AIPAC is kind of an old advocacy group that is working.
Can you just explain what AIPAC is, Ilan? Just explain what AIPAC stands for.
Yeah, AIPAC is the pro-Israeli Jewish lobby in America, which works alongside with the Christian Zionist lobby. Two very powerful lobbies working on behalf of Israel.
Yeah, no, indeed.
Just one last question, Chris.
Okay, we've got time.
From Mark Anderson. He says, does the panel think that Labour's threat to free speech will change university students' position on deplatforming of certain controversial speakers?
Oh, interesting. What do you think, Jackie?
Are you controversial, Chris?
Well, I don't think I am, but anyway, go on. What do you think, Jackie?
I'm actually not quite sure what that question means. I mean, in terms of Labour's, do I think it will affect universities and the way that they invite people? Well, it's affecting them already. You know, like Chris says, I mean, this is an ongoing issue. And I also agree, by the way, with Ilan, is that a number of universities that I went to, it was Palestinian groups who insisted on their right to have invited me as a speaker. And even though they had to have, you know, I don't know, one of the bods from the executive chair or whatever come and listen to me in case I said something hateful, you know, they actually stood out and insisted that that should happen. And I think somehow what we've got to do, and I think, it would be great if we could think how to do this, is actually encourage more student organizations, Palestinian organizations, pro-Palestinian organizations, to actually purposefully organize a series of speakers to actually test this and push this and insist on their own right to invite who they want to speak to them.
Yeah. And Ilan, just kind of building on that a little bit, I think you mentioned earlier about the kind of the emergence, or it might have been Jackie, apologies, I can't remember who it was now, about the emergence of the Black Lives Matter campaign, for example, and how there kind of is a kind of a crossover, and does that give us some hope that that sort of solidarity in that sense through these new movements which are coming to the fore now could help us to fight back and promote the cause of the Palestinian people, and in the same way that Black Lives Matter is kind of campaigning on obviously the mistreatment of black communities in the US and obviously here.
Yes, definitely. I think one important group that suffers from racism, they really suffer from institutional racism, is the Muslim community of Britain. Islamophobia is far more widespread in Britain than anti-Jewishness. And I think there is solidarity between the Muslim communities and many of the Palestinians and the people who support the Palestinians. So this network, I think, is already there. And of course, the Black British community as well, I think, is beginning to understand the connections between the way they were treated and the Palestinians were treated. It took some time also for the African American community. If you remember, At first, there was quite a lot of support to the Jews, as if they were, the African slaves who were liberated in Liberia, which is called Palestine. I think this has changed dramatically, and I think there's a lot of understanding, as was in the 1970s, in the working class, of the connection between imperial oppression and capitalist oppression. I think these networks, some of them are old, can be revived. There are new ones to be worked on, and I think yes. And as I said before, I don't think it even has to be just national. It has to be continental. It has to be global. We need all the allies that we can get, because we are all in the same boat. This is a world where neoliberalism, settler colonialism, and new kind of imperialism is going to oppress workers and native people alike, unless they will unite together and struggle against it. Struggling for Palestine is struggling for social justice in many other places, not just in Palestine itself.
Well, that's an uplifting and inspiring way to, I think, end our discussion this evening. We've gone just a minute over our scheduled hour. Thanks very much indeed to Ilan Pappé and Jackie Walker for your contributions this evening. Thank you, everybody, for watching and for your questions. Please tune in next week at the same time on Wednesday, 7 o'clock. We will be discussing with the people who are behind the launch of a new left-wing daily, a new left-wing weekly newspaper that will be coming out in the new year. So that's quite an exciting prospect to look forward to in the new year. So if you've got a spare hour next Wednesday at 7 o'clock, please tune in and listen to that discussion too. That leaves me just to say good night. Thank you for watching and have a pleasant evening.